Come on in and find a seat. It's so great to be back in this room. I'm sure that many of you can say that who've been here before. Can you hear me okay in the back? Okay, and raise your hand if my voice falls, because it might, and just let me know if you can't hear. One of the things that when you become a teacher you learn to tolerate are introductions. Thank you so much. Very kind and generous. Sometimes it's a little difficult even to start speaking because it's so, it seems so complete just to sit here and look. Just to be with each other is such a rich and wonderful thing. This is one of the challenges and one of the great blessings that came from COVID, which is so many people find wonderful centers like this and connect, and it's helped everyone so much during the time of COVID. And then once we can come back together in person, we were just talking about this, you don't say to the other folks, it was nice to see you, goodbye. No, now you're part of the family. And so everybody goes hybrid so that we can make sure that we embrace and support and encourage practice every place EBS is touched. And they in turn offer their practice to you here. It's a lovely way to connect. So we'll be tonight, I'm going to speak about some things to, in some ways, reintroduce myself to you, because it was 19, so it's been 3 years, a little more. That's kind of how it's going these days, isn't it? And also to reorient you or orient some of you to the Zen tradition and in the way that it approaches the situation at hand. It's quite a situation these days, isn't it? And so I want to speak in a very broad and inclusive context tonight about that and how Zen practice addresses the situation we find ourselves in, and then during the retreat we'll go further into this returning home theme, looking at precepts and ethical foundations of Buddhism as well. So this is like on the machines where you have to refresh, this is the refreshing and starting again. There's a dedication that I really enjoy and that I appreciate and that touches me from our tradition, and one of the variations of this dedication, since we're a Mahayana practice, a Bodhisattva practice of practicing for the benefit of all beings, we say, may all awakened beings extend with true compassion their luminous mirror wisdom. May the merit and virtue of this meeting and all of your individual practices extend to all beings everywhere. May all be relieved of suffering, free from fear, longing, aversion, and ignorance, and may the way of awakening go on endlessly. I'll say it again. But this time I think we should have a bell, don't you think? It's kind of nice because the sound it's like that going on endlessly. May all awakened beings, that includes, may all awakened beings extend with true compassion their luminous mirror wisdom when we see each other. May the merit and virtue of this meeting tonight and all the practices that you do on your own May they extend to all beings everywhere, not just in the room, and maybe like to the Capitol. May all be relieved of suffering, free from fear, longing, aversion, and ignorance. And may this way of awakening go on endlessly. It's nice to take the time, just a few breaths to allow the sound to complete itself. And one of the things I appreciate about this center is the ecumenical nature of it in terms of Buddhist practice. And so I want to start with a few things that I hope will be interesting and maybe even inspiring to you in some ways. Some things from the past, the far distant past, and something in the not so far distant past and in the present, to sort of weave together where the Zen, and I will be also using another term that you might not be familiar with, Chan. Chan, C-H-A-N, is the practice that began in China that became Zen in Japan. It's the same word, but it's said differently. And of course, the Buddhism in Japan, in the Chan tradition at least, was part of how Buddhism moved through northern India, through Tibet, where wonderful traditions arose, of course, that are still existing, that are quite powerful, flowed over the Himalayas into China and met the Taoist tradition. So Chan, in some ways, people think of as Buddho-Taoism. You know, it's kind of a hybrid. And then it had its own flavor in Korea and Japan, and now here, like this. Here, there's some artifacts from the ancient things, but I'm going to read a 4-line poem in English, which was originally written in Japanese, by the monk EQ. Any of you ever heard of EQ? What was he like, do you know? You know about him?
No, I don't. I just know that I was...
He was a wild guy.
Oh.
Yeah, he was the kind of guy that would go to the brothels and various places and, and see where there was need, And he was very dynamic and engaged. I'll read the translation of the poem, but imagine that it was written about now, about the situation now. Here's what he wrote. A belly swollen, full of hell, unending eons of passion, wildfires burning without end, but flowering grasses are born again in the spring wind. A belly swollen, full of news, hell, unending eons of passions and politics, wildfires burning without end, the planet burning without end, but flowering grasses are born again in the spring wind. All of this, and yet. And here's a little religious history for you. In the 6th century, a new kind of Chan developed. It had been in China for a long time in response to the cataclysmic proceedings that were happening in China at that time. And I'm reviewing this because I think it's interesting, because it kind of fits in some ways where we are this day. In the space of 10 years in the 6th century, 2/3 of the population of China was wiped out. I mean, the number of people dying from COVID is small compared to 2/3 of the population of China by epidemics, rebellion, famine, and disease. And so there were a few teachers, a few innovators, who wanted not to just escape the catastrophe they were in, but they needed to find a way to meet it more fully. And what, centuries later, after World War II, you know, the French mystic Simone Weil, to meet it with what she called a just and loving gaze. I'm going to read a few sentences from the Zen teacher Joan Sutherland, not the opera star, but because she says it so well, I couldn't do it better, so here's what she wrote, reflecting on what was happening in that time. She said, if they were going to be helpful, they had to develop, and quickly, flexibility of mind, an easy relationship with the unknown, and a robust willingness to engage with life as they found it. Perhaps most importantly, they needed a really big view. For them, Chan practice wasn't about getting free of the world. It was about being free in the world. It wasn't about getting free of anything. It was being fully free in everything. If you don't remember anything else, that turn is enough right there. She goes on. How do we fall willingly into the frightening, blasted, beautiful, tender world? How do we fall willingly into this whole catastrophe? Because, to paraphrase Peter Hershock, who's a friend of mine in Honolulu, by the way, in his wonderful study on Chan, it's not enough to see what Buddha nature is. You have to realize what Buddha nature does. This isn't about just realizing some special aspect of your mind or consciousness. What does that realization and what does that awakening do in the world? And that's a different perspective, isn't it? And in the midst of the catastrophe that these women and men who were teachers at that time were facing, they realized this is what's essential. This is no time to fall into despair or lack of confidence, or to run away. Although, you don't have to raise your hand. Like, how many people have felt like that? You know. So the practices they developed were all about remaining engaged. And this is really important. We were just speaking about this a little before we started. So they took, these ancestors actually moved the Chan tradition from an introspective meditation practice that turned your attention inward, and it raised its gaze. It raised its horizon to see what needed to be done in the world. And what they discovered is it's all the things you're turning in for, it's all right here. And seeing this invites a deeper look into the life that you have and the relationships that you're immersed in. So our practices are not just about the vastness, which is kind of the product or the engine of concentration, but it's made up of the relationships and the practices that we do as a community. It's not about just going this way. It's about reaching a hand out too. So let's look at another turbulent time. You got that perspective on China and where this came from. It was a big turn. It was a revolution in Zen, actually, and in Buddhism, a particular type at that time. Let's go to another time. Some of you are old enough in here to remember the Beat generation and the 60s. Some of you are too young. But it's coming back around, you know, especially in fashion. You know, you see. So there was a particular poem that Allen Ginsberg wrote that the title of this poem was Song. I'm not going to read the whole poem, it's quite long, but here's the beginning. And think about this now in terms of the pandemic and where we've been, returning here. Under the burden of solitude, under the burden of dissatisfaction, the weight we carry is love. Under the burden of solitude, under the burden of dissatisfaction, the weight we carry is love. Suffering under such a weight, for most of us, is accompanied by this longing. Under dissatisfaction and separation, this longing for this. And this poem, the whole thing really expresses something about how this longing to return, and that's the theme of our retreat, is a return to, well, these human possibilities which have a lot of names, like we hear them in Buddhism: wholeness, oneness, unity, our true self, all these things, which Ginsberg is calling love. It's like in writing the poem, he had this intuitive sense that these twin burdens of solitude and dissatisfaction might be relieved if, in fact, through practice, we could realize this wholeness and unity and connection and find a way to express it as love in the world. That might satisfy that longing. The longing for, in some ways, maybe you felt this, a longing for completion, because once again, you don't have to raise your hand, but that sense of walking around the world like, something's not right. Or I'm not right, something's missing. There's got, like, really, this is it? And so this longing for completion and a wholeness is a universal spiritual longing. Like, why do you come to things like this? There's something that I kind of lean forward when I say it, like something that you're interested in. And at the end of the poem, it's another little piece. And he repeats words that are kind of like a heartbeat and this longing and this love. He said, yes, yes, that's what I wanted. I always wanted to return to the body where I was born. Yes, yes, that's what I wanted. I always wanted to return to the body where I was born. It's to return to who we really are. The body of wholeness, this body of unity, which Ginsberg's calling the body of love. This is the body that he longed for. Anybody else feel that longing? Like you'd like to return to your most whole and unified self. And I think also we long for it for the people we love. So this is a journey of return. And I think it's the shared longing at this moment, not only just to return to the room, but we're not returning as in going back, are we? Because there's no going back. I did a talk recently, and the title was something like, Getting Back to Normal and Other Lies I've Believed. No getting back. There's no going back. We're forming something new. And our shared longing is in some way is the transmutation, or our practice really, is the transmutation of this longing into bodhicitta. How do we take deep human longing and transform it into something that is the desire for everyone to be free and without suffering. That's the one to send over to the Capitol, huh? I don't want to get into this too much, but I just had another group I was talking to that was near Capitol. I said, so here's the fantasy I have. We were studying the Metta Sutta, the Sutra on Loving Kindness, and we were chanting it. I said, here's my fantasy. When it comes time to vote on any piece of legislation, they have to first all chant the Metta Sutra. They stand up in whatever house, House of Representatives, Senate, doesn't matter. Then they file out and walk completely through the Capitol to the other chamber, looking at the pictures and the history, remembering who they are and where they came from. And the people who are visiting are their constituents, and they have to see them. They circumambulate the other chamber, they come back, then they vote. It's an idea. And then each house would have to do that, I thought, they would, yeah, this is what should be accomplished by the one who's wise, Anyway. So this original body that you want to return to, that we want to return to, that the poet is speaking about, and this transmutation of this longing into bodhicitta, we began to realize through practice that this original body is not dimmed and hasn't been destroyed or diminished by all the things that are happening, or your own personal difficulties, under the weight of circumstances, under the burden of isolation and dissatisfaction. And this is the alchemy of practice, which transforms personal longing into the heart and mind of a bodhisattva. And this is truly a wonder, especially in the face of uncertainty. So remember Ginsberg talking about under the burden of solitude, under the burden of dissatisfaction, the weight we carry is love. So the question of practice is, how do you carry it? Practice is about carrying. And how does it look now? So I'm going to read a short paragraph that I wrote for myself in preparation, trying to understand the questions here. And then I'm going to go through each sentence, because after I wrote it, I thought, that would be the talk. So this was kind of like came from my own journal. So imagine for a moment, we're just kind of sitting in meditation as if this was guidance. Okay? And it's just like 6 or 7 sentences. There we go. We never really know what's coming. We're constantly walking through the vulnerable territory of impermanence and uncertainty. Whether we are awake to it or not, but these past few years have brought it all so much closer than ever before. Even though we don't know what is next, we are nevertheless challenged to remain upright, attentive, alert, and responsive. What does the Dharma teach in terms of our human capacity for responding to suffering in its many forms, even as we embrace the uncertainties of life? How do we maintain wonder and imagination without closing down? How do we continue to work for the benefit of others when we feel our own life is challenged? So these are some of the essential questions that I think we meet along our shared path as we attempt to maintain the sense of wonder in the face of uncertainty. So there's 2 statements and there's 3 questions. That seem okay? Does this resonate at all with? Okay. So the retreat theme, finding our way home, walking the bodhisattva path when our world is spinning. This is about maintaining wonder in the face of uncertainty instead of all the other things that we feel and get caught in. The first sentence in my little journaling was, we never really know what's coming. That's where it started, right? I said that and I paused and I saw some of you going, what next? You know? It's hard to believe, isn't it? But you know what? We're constantly walking through the vulnerable territory of impermanence and uncertainty. All the time. Whether we're awake to it or not. And yes, in the past few years, things have seemed to like rubbed our face in it. But this is always true. And it's always been true. Every day, and in every circumstance, we don't know what's going to happen. And our practice is to remain awake and alert and aware. Resting in beginner's mind, that retreat we didn't have, we had a talk on it, remember? To see as clearly as we can what is unfolding and to remain awake to our responses in each moment, which are very much part of this kind of unfolding. You know, it's always like this, and we always have the same choice. How are you going to respond to it? And that's what makes a difference in practice. Maybe some of you have heard this, but I was asked a few years ago to give a TED talk. I did at TEDx Austin. Some of you have seen it probably. And as I was preparing for it, I had a coach, a woman who's now 80 years old, who's also one of my students, which is very humbling. A wonderful woman, Margaret Keyes in Austin. She was Michael Dell's coach for his speeches and many other well-known people. She's wonderful, but she's a remarkable woman. So she was helping me. And she was with me on the day before the TED conference because we had to go through tech rehearsal. Kind of like we did this afternoon, only much more complicated. And part of it is in segments, once we were told how to get on and off the stage and all that kind of stuff, each speaker would go in order so they could practice doing that act of getting on and getting off. And they would go through the first few lines of their talk just to make sure the prompt worked and all that stuff. So I'm sitting there in the front row in the dark, looking up at this big stage. Margaret's sitting next to me. And here's the thing. I didn't have the opening to my speech yet. Well, because these people are wickedly smart. If you don't get them in the first 30 seconds, they're like, So you have to you can't talk your way into it. You got to come out, boom. And Margaret had told me this. And I turned to Margaret as I listened to about 5 or 6 of the people before me do their thing. All about, how they're going to change the world. And I turned to her and said, but Margaret, my message isn't about how to change the world. It's about how to change the world that never stops changing. There was the line. Out of that moment of pressure, my message isn't about changing the world. It's about how do we change the way that we may meet a world that never stops changing. Richard Heckler, who's a good friend of mine, who was on the board at Spirit Rock, in California, and a great Tibetan student also, and a Hakomi trainer. He tweeted the next day, best first line of a TED Talk ever, which is humble of me to say, right? But it was sweet to hear it from a good friend, It's very nice. This isn't about changing the world. It's about how we change the way we respond to it. The great master, teacher, and writer and environmentalist Joanna Macy, who's a wonderful Buddhist teacher, she's in her 90s now. She said, what we try to do is explain, predict, and control rather than appreciate our life. We want to be able to explain it and predict what's going to happen and control it, and then we think we're okay. If you want that, go ahead and leave. Buddhism will not give you that, but it will help you appreciate your life. like the one you have. It's like approaching a Zen koan. You know about those stories, which are vignettes, really, of interactions between students and teachers that have a bit of freedom in them, and they keep freeing other people. And centuries later, when you engage them and sit with them, and it's sort of like that, because people try to solve the koan of life, like you're going to solve life. Which, anybody ever notice that doesn't happen? You're not going to solve life. But you can live your way into it more deeply and more fully. And this is where these kind of teachings were pointing, because in Zen, Zen people, Tibetan people talk about emptiness. Because when you awaken, the maps that hold your beliefs are suddenly gone. You don't hold your beliefs anymore. You're not going to replace your beliefs with new, like, spiritual beliefs. You're going to lose these maps we call beliefs. And new maps will appear on their own, but you take them as provisional. Let's see, So in Zen practice, we say we open ourselves to the gates of the world beyond our prejudices. We open ourselves to the Dharma gate, the gates of the world beyond our prejudices. Like the Buddha, leaving home, the gates open, we were over the wall, really, they say, and he met, someone who's ill, someone who's old, someone who's really sick, a dead person, and a sage, beyond what he understood, beyond what he was certain about. And here's the thing about certainty. Some of you have heard me say this before. And this is a quote I took from John Tarrant, another wonderful Zen teacher. It says, unkindness comes out of certainty. And when we let go of certainty, what remains is the bare reality of consciousness. And another name for that is love. Now we're circling back. Unkindness comes out of certainty. Somebody asked me recently when I used this quote, they said, what do you mean? I said, watch Fox News. Sorry. Unkindness comes out of certainty. And when we let go of certainty, what remains is the bare reality of consciousness. Without our ideas, without our ideals, without all things we can explain, predict, and control, we have consciousness, awareness, that's ready and open and alive. And another name for that is love. So when we let go of certainty, most of us feel like we've lost our ground. That's why it's not popular, because it's challenging, But equally, I think if you stay with it and practice and really engage the practices in a wholesome way, and maybe work with a teacher, not only you might feel the terror or whatever of losing ground, but you might also feel that you've escaped from a prison. Because when you're not bound by the story of your life, all the stories you use to hold it together, which are fictions really, and not bound by the effort of knowing what everything is and where it's all going to go and what it should be, then a new kind of freedom appears. And in that case, then everything you look at, the walls, the flowers here, your friends, somebody you thought you didn't like, everything is suddenly full of possibility. When it's not bound by your story, by your narrative, by your expectations. The freedom I'm talking about is right in front of you all the time. All that's required is that all of your expectations and dreams get pulled out from under you. And then you begin to experience the wonder and the beauty of just being here. Resting in the bare reality of consciousness, as Tarrant said, and what Ginsberg called love. what EQ talked about as, and the grasses keep growing in the spring. In other words, nature continues. Because we never really know what's coming. And that's the part of the direction we use to find our way home. I was talking to a good friend of mine the other day who was a scientist and an entrepreneur. He's a good friend of mine on Molokai. He did something unique in his life. As a scientist, he started a company back in the 90s to solve a really important problem. And he was the principal, one person, grew to 1,500 people. And through the late 90s, 80s and early 90s, they developed the first protease inhibitor, which made the HIV cocktail work. I said, Peter, you changed the world, at least in some parts of it, And by the way, thanks for saving my friends. And he talked about not knowing if they could solve it, not knowing if their idea was different than other people's, and if it would pan out. But they gave their best effort, and then something did happen that changed everything. And he's one of the most humble people I've ever met. You never expect these kind of things. And so the next sentence in my little 5-sentence thing that I wrote was, even though we don't know what's next, we are nevertheless challenged to remain upright, attentive, alert, and responsive. So you don't know what's next. You can do what's ordinary, which is complain about it, react to it, make it work. Norman Fisher, one of my teachers, he says the reason we sit on these cushions is just to stop making things worse. And the immediacy of the pandemic, has brought all of this horror and difficulty, but it's also brought this kind of beauty, like connecting with all these people is a small example. And some of the ways that people have responded and turned to a beautiful thing, just like I was saying my friend did during another kind of epidemic at one point. And this interest into wonder in this way is what I call embodied immediacy. This is what practice helps us do. If practice isn't embodied, it's not an idea. It's a whole body response to life. And it's about the immediacy of the moment. Embodied immediacy. Can we actually meet the world as it is? And through practice, we notice anything that dulls this and turns us away from the wonder and the possibility of being in life. And we look at things that support and encourages embodied immediacy. That's what we practice, that's what we sit. And it kind of turns on the light of wonder. So my friend Peter the other day was talking about one of his good friends that they still talk, because he knows people that have Nobel Prizes and stuff. And one of his guys at Caltech, who's one of these old scientists, is still brilliant, writing books still. They were talking about climate change. And this fellow was telling my friend, he said, this warming thing we're doing it now, he said, that's nothing. It's happened a lot of times. If you look at history, it's happened on the planet many times, and CO2 levels have been way higher than it is right now. We don't survive, but the Earth is fine. The Earth is going to be just fine. When the things that are killing it go away, it'll heal itself. And so he talked about a big view. He said, this has happened before. The people didn't create it, but it happened. And worse things have happened, and the earth, in the spring, the grasses still grow. So you take this larger view. And the practices that we engage in in Zen practice at least, are mostly about embodied immediacy. We ask you to do stuff, like sit upright. Don't worry about it now. I mean, in Zazen, you're not just kind of like hanging around. Because in Zazen, you're not meditating to achieve some special state. You're sitting to express your Buddha nature. It's a little ceremony of expression. And so you sit upright like a Buddha would sit, even if you don't feel like one. This is the spiritual version of fake it till you make it, And the upright, attentive balance is the embodiment of moral conduct, ethics. Being aligned and balanced. Attentive and alert, of course, you want to be awake. This is mindfulness training. The ability to be flexible and responsive in the world. And remember, I mentioned in that quote, Peter Hershock, he wrote this book on Chan that Joan Sutherland had referred to. He was talking about we don't need to just know what Buddha nature is or what it does. He describes awakening in the best way I've ever heard it. He calls it improvisational virtuosity. Jazz. You practice diligently and consistently like you would with your instrument. So much so that it becomes who you are. So if someone plays a little riff or a chord or something, and you're going to improvise, you're going to respond with something that receives and guides and encourages, and something like music instead of just noise. But you're doing it without having to think about it, because that's how you've practiced. And suddenly something totally unique and wonderful is produced. Improvisational virtuosity. That's how we meet life. I just think it's a great analog to think about how this is. Even though you don't know what's coming next, you don't know what the saxophone guy's going to play, We're nevertheless challenged to remain upright, attentive, alert, aware, and responsive. Because I like poetry, here's Rumi, okay? It's always good to go to Rumi, And you've heard this one before, but I want you to listen to it in the framework that I'm laying out tonight about Chan Zen practice. In fact, the first part of this poem sometimes isn't, the second part you'll recognize. The first part's not usually included. Here's the whole poem. For years, copying other people, I tried to know myself. From within, I couldn't decide what to do. Unable to see, I heard my name being called, and then I walked outside. The breeze at dawn has secrets to tell. Don't go back to sleep. You must ask for what you really want. Don't go back to sleep. People are going back and forth across the door sill where the two worlds touch. The door is round and open. Don't go back to sleep. Isn't this great? For years, copying other people, I tried to know myself. Oh, Lord. How am I supposed to be? Who am I supposed to be? For whom? Entire self-help industries are built on copying. Do it this way. They might be useful, but they're producing new conditioned experience. From within, I couldn't decide what to do, he says. Unable to see, I heard my name being called. So that's the longing. Something's tugging. What is it? What is it? What is it? Maybe I'll go to EBS on Friday night, and maybe that guy, something. I heard my name being called. Then I walked outside. He walked into the world. He didn't retreat from it. He walked out into the world, and you can feel the breeze. Oh, the breeze has secrets to tell you. The world is going to offer itself to you and teach you whatever you want. There's the line we're going to chant tomorrow, which says, each moment, life as it is, the only teacher. You must ask for what you really want. All of you will have questions, and we'll have time for questions. And during the retreat, we will too, deep questions. And then I'm going to ask you, what's the question under the question? The real question. If you're honest. And he keeps saying, don't go back to sleep. Don't go back to sleep. And then people are going back and forth across the door sill. What is that? Where the two worlds meet. You know, from the ordinary to the sublime, from the everyday, mundane, to the, you can't even say it, where the two worlds meet. This building is one of those meeting places. It says the door is round and open. In other words, the invitation to awakening is always open, it's never closed. Don't go back to sleep. So, we've gone through the first two sentences. Here's the third sentence. What does the Dharma teach in terms of our human capacity for responding to suffering in its many forms, even as we embrace the uncertainties of life? A little wordy, but what is that? This is all the Dharma ever teaches, and everything it teaches. Suzuki Roshi, who wrote, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, or his talks actually, or whatever in there. Anybody in here read his biography, Crooked Cucumber? A few people have. That book starts with the story. David Chadwick, who's the author, wild guy from Fort Worth, Texas. He was in the monastery at Tassajara, and after a Dharma talk, question and answer, he raised his hand, and he asked the kind of question that every Zen student will ask. They know exactly what the teacher will say, but they want to ask it anyway to see what the teacher will say. And he basically said, well, this is the kind of question that you ask when you know the teacher actually won't answer it, but you want to know. He said, Roshi, I hear your talks. It's very beautiful. I feel quite inspired, but I do not understand it. And could you summarize Buddhism in a couple of words? And he didn't expect him to do it, but he said in the intro, he said, but that night he did. He looked right at him and said, everything changes. Next question. Exactly what we're talking about. So this is all the Dharma ever is about and what it's teaching us. How to meet the world that never stops changing. And what the Dharma will teach you is how to say yes to what comes. And that yes looks kind of like, well, what do we call it in Buddhism? Nirvana? You know what nirvana is? Freedom from your reactivity. It's not an esoteric state up in heaven or something, some special blissed out. It's just completely free of your reactivity. And what is samsara? The unconscious playing out of your habit patterns. Those are the same old, That's good enough for me. And the Four Noble Truths that the Buddha talked about, it's a little bit of a problem, I think, to call them truths. I don't have a problem with the teaching, they're beautiful, but calling them in the English translation truths is like their beliefs, which is a little bit of a problem. You know the old teaching story about that from the Buddhist time, about belief? There was you know who Mara is? In the iconography, Mara is like the devil, like the tempter. He was the one that was confronting the Buddha in the Enlightenment story, trying to throw him off, and he was vanquished by the Buddha. Anyway, so Mara and his minions are hanging around, and this woman or man, this woman comes walking down the road, and they see that she's awake. They can tell, like, whoa. And so they say, hey, we got a problem. Because here's one who's awake, we got to do something. And Mara looks at her and says, don't worry about it. She'll turn it into a belief. Well, she'll make it small and try to explain and predict and control what she's waked up to. This immense wonder that's beyond any of that. So that's my little soapbox about truths. But And so most of you are familiar with Four Noble Truths too, right? Which is, first, life is characterized by dukkha, not suffering. Life is characterized, every life has its share of dukkha. The word dukkha, in its most literal meaning, is the axle of a wheel that's stuck. Whereas the thing around which everything else moves is like, it's not flowing freely. So it's more like dissatisfaction. Things not, it's life. And if you read the Buddha's actual sermon on what we call the Four Noble Truths, he says, dukkha is, and then there's a list. Birth, death, pain, lamentation, he lists a long list. And so you know what it amounts to? Dukkha, life isn't suffering. Life is like everything that it is. It's everything. If you're going to have a life, you get the whole thing. Except we don't like everything. That's the second noble truth. There's stuff we grasp onto because we want to have it, and there's stuff we don't like, we're going to push away, and a whole bunch of stuff we ignore or don't understand. That's greed, hate, and delusion. The three poisons. They're not poisons. They're how our psychology functions normally, actually. But if we believe that stuff and take it as truth, our little version of the world, we're going to have more dukkha. Third noble truth usually talks about, the word nirodha is used, which is like cessation or something like that, like blowing out a candle. But actually that's not the meaning. When the Buddha was giving this talk, he was giving his original talk to fire worshippers in India. So he's using that analogy. He said, the third noble truth is nirodha is the turn. Ni, the prefix, means down, and rodha means an earth bank. If you have a fire, as fire worshippers, you want to make sure you have an earth bank to keep the fire contained. If you have no earth bank, everything gets burned up. If you put dirt on it, there's no energy. You don't want to stop it, but you also don't want, you want to have a way to contain life energy and use it for good. So, first noble truth, dukkha happens. It's a bumper sticker. Number two, marga is the word in Sanskrit, which means that which comes up in response to dukkha. And number three, the key word nirodha, is this earth bank. We got to contain, we don't want to become like robots with no energy, with no vitality, with no aliveness. When you watch any of the Tibetan teachers, do they seem dull? No. They're like, mainly they're laughing. You know, they're full of vitality. You see the Dalai Lama? You see some of the Zen guys like EQ? I mean, they're like full of life. This is about, I'm doing another retreat pretty soon about, Buddhism isn't about the stopping of suffering, it's about the restoration of joy. It's restoring fullness of life, you know. So nirodha is containing the energies which necessarily happen and using them and channeling for good. And guess what the fourth noble truth is? The path to how to do that. To be, marga is the word that's often used for, that we translate as right view, right, you know all that? You know what that word means in Sanskrit? It's like, the analogy is like the part of the water in the river where everything is going together and not caught in eddies or blocked. It's just open and flowing together. So that means not you have a right as opposed to wrong. That means you have a view that's in accord with life. You have an attitude is in accord with life. Actually, life as it is. So I like Stephen Batchelor's way of talking about this. Instead of the Four Noble Truths, he called them the four tasks. And he uses a little different words. He says, number one, the first one, embrace suffering. In other words, can we realize that difficulties happen, not just difficult circumstances, We have difficult feelings, thoughts. Can we choose it and say, yes, that's the first yes, this is my life. I'm not going to wait for another one to be happy. Can I be awake and find out how to live in this body, at this time, with these people, under these circumstances? Because I don't really have a choice. This is actually the one I'm in. And how am I going to turn that toward the good? The job of every bodhisattva is to take each moment and turn it just a little bit more towards awakening. That's the job, if you're going to sign up for this practice. So embrace suffering. Not like, oh, isn't it great that I have cancer? No, that's not the point. I have this terrible thing happening. How can I embrace the reality of it and see how I will move with it? That's what I mean. Not like, oh, good, terrible things are happening. No. Can I, instead of fighting it, can I say, okay, this is happening. How am I going to meet it? And what's the alchemy that will turn it towards something that's useful? Number 2, the reactivity part. Let your reactive emotions alone. The Buddha was asked one time, how do we deal with difficult emotions? He said, gaze upon them with kindness and remain still. Just don't get so worked up about what you feel. Now, it doesn't mean ignore it either. There are plenty of things that feel pretty bad, and there are a lot of things that are really quite destructive. Shame, trauma, a lot of things are terrible. So we do need to know how to meet it in a wholesome way, in the way that will turn it towards something that will be good for yourself and good for other people. And number 3, third double truth, see the stopping of reactivity. Notice that, there are moments when you aren't caught in reactivity. Those little moments when you're actually, like, for example, I can imagine being in this room. Which way is that? That's north, right? Okay. So I can imagine being in this room, if you slept in here. You've been here early in the morning? Anybody? And you see the first light, and something happens, like the light touches a tree or top of a building, or you go out and you hear the first bird song. Those moments where you're just like caught for a second, like Rumi walking out, and you're not thinking about yourself, are you? And you're not worried about that's nirvana. That's all we're talking about. Those moments where you're free. You have nirvanic moments. Don't worry about absolute forever. How about nirvanic moments where you'll be free? That's what this is about. And then, number 4, respond with care. At the end of his life, at the end of the whole Pali canon, in other words, in the language Pali, the entire Buddhist teachings, last sentence, translated, things fall apart, carry forward or tread with, and the last word is appamada, the word we use for our center. That's the last word of the Buddha in the Pali Canon. Okay, that word is usually translated as diligence. But Putin is diligent, but not wholesome. Is it okay to say that kind of thing? There are certain people who have done things that are not very nice, but they're diligent. So diligence is not I don't think it's a great translation. In the context, you understand what it means. But if you look more deeply, appamada, pamada, without the up, it means like sort of misguided, unregulated, drunk. Not, appamada means not that. It means the mind, through practice, becomes it cares for your true nature. It's like the container for it. So the best word for appamada really is mindful, diligent care, which is what he's saying at the end. In fact, there's a sutra, the Appamada Sutra. It's really short. I'll tell you a short contemporary version of it. A rich man, this is real, in the Appamada Sutra, this rich guy comes to the Buddha And he says, I'm going to do it in a contemporary way, but he says this, and you know how the sutras are, they have that repetition stuff, so you can remember it. And he comes to the Buddha and he said, I'm a busy guy, I got meetings, you know, you got to be fast, I need to know the Dharma, can you just give it to me quick? And Buddha says, sure, practice with appamada. He said, I don't have time to waste. I need you to like really tell me the real thing. Buddha said, practice with appamada. And he said, look, I'm going to go now, but can you please just give me, he said, practice with appamada. And the guy leaves. And the Buddha looks around. He said, like I told him 3 times. He didn't get it. He said, appamada is the elephant's footprint. It's the biggest footprint in the forest. All the other footprints fit inside of it. Mindful, diligent care is the whole thing. Whether it goes this way or whether it goes this way. It's the same thing. So in facing this unpredictable world that we're caught in, it threatens our whole notions of like health, safety, civic cooperation, long-term survival, a few things like that. We might have to, number one, first task, not the first truth, we might have to embrace the possibility that we're going to have to live in a different way, characterized by at least the habits that we express in our work and our family, and we might have to shift a little bit. Maybe it's not good for me to travel all the way here. You know, you have to ask that question on airplanes, which may feel like a lot of loss. We may experience loss and even pain when compared to the relative ease we remember, like wanting to go back. It may not go that way, so we have to embrace the possibilities. 2, not be paralyzed or propelled into violence or stick our head in the sand. It's greed, hate, and delusion again. But not be stopped by our personal anxiety or the social context created by all these changes and demands. And number 3, containment, dwelling in a space of fearless awareness, which is the same thing as fierce awareness. You're not going to be without fear. I was at a New Year's Eve party one time. We had this, toy balloons full of helium and things. Maybe you've done this before. And they had these pads of paper. And our friends, this is when, we didn't think about littering too much, I guess. They said, write what you want to release for the new year, roll it up, tie it on the thing, we'll go out and we'll all release the balloons. It was a little symbol of releasing things. And so one of my friends, who's a fellow psychotherapist, was next to me, and we were standing there. And she said, what'd you write down? I said, fear. She said, oh, honey, give that up. Said, you're always going to have fear. We're going to let go of is your fear of fear. Dwelling in fierce awareness, not fearless, meaning no fear. The fierceness to even face all your fears. This is the larger container. Joko Beck, I asked her, how do you know if you're doing the right practice? She said, are you becoming a larger container for life energy? Life energy is super powerful, really fierce. It wants a channel to flow through, and we are those channels. But mostly we're contracted and conditioned to be small, and it's painful as we open up so life can move through us generously and generatively. And then number 4, respond creatively to produce a more awake and more aware, more balanced, more healthy world. Are we going to 8:30?
We can go to 9 if you
Oh,
want.
no. I
Whatever you want.
don't want to keep people too long. That's way too long. I'm just checking. I can see that. So here, I'm going to give you some words from Stephen Batchelor, because he's another one that used great words, and I can't say it better. So here's what I copied down from his. He said, the 4 tasks demand direct engagement with life itself, irrespective of any beliefs about the origins and the end of suffering or the nature of the self. In other words, origins of suffering, the end of suffering, the nature of self, the stuff we mainly study in Buddhism. The 4 tasks demand a direct engagement with life, regardless of any of the answers to any of those questions. By entering into a contemplative, empathic, an existential, in other words, contemplative, empathic, and existential relationship with the pain of the world, one seeks to respond with situation-specific compassion. That's like that improvisational virtuosity, you know. The challenge, now he says the challenge is to tackle the crisis at hand, which may be unprecedented. Like, yeah. And find imaginative responses that may not have occurred to anyone before. Taking into account the causal role played by psychological factors, such as greed, dislike, and stupidity. I love that he used that. Anyone in mind? Sorry. One's primary concern is to arrive at a response based on an understanding of the full range of particular conditions, biological, social, economic, religious, political, notice the whole shooting match, that underlie and contribute to the crisis. So that's a lot, isn't it? I'm going to read it again now straight through without interrupting myself. The 4 tasks demand direct engagement with life itself, irrespective of any beliefs about the origins or the end of suffering or the nature of the self. By entering into a contemplative, empathic, and existential relationship with the pain of the world, one seeks to respond with situation-specific compassion. The challenge is to tackle the crisis at hand, which may be unprecedented, and find imaginative responses that may not have occurred to anyone before. Taking into account the causal role played by psychological factors, such as greed, dislike, and stupidity, one's primary concern is to arrive at a response based on an understanding of the full range of particular conditions. And he lists all those conditions that underlie and contribute to the crisis. So I keep saying the same thing over and over because you need to. So there's 2 more questions. I'll go briefly on. How do we maintain wonder and imagination without closing down? Remember that sentence, without closing down? So this is the central function of practice. Not close down. To be that open container. Quite simply, like in a retreat, is how to keep going and don't quit. It was a pretty famous person who came to sit back when Suzuki Roshi was alive in San Francisco. And he'd not done many retreats before, but they let him in. And after about the 4th day of a 7-day retreat, any of you done long retreats? You know, about the 4th day, it's like, why did I think this was a good idea? You know, he came to Suzuki Roshi for Dokusan for a private interview, and he said, I can't do this. I can't do it. I'm going to have to leave. And Suzuki said, okay. He said, we try, and we try, and we try, and we fail. Then we go deeper. It's the giving up which makes the space for what can now happen. Because now we can't predict, we can't control, we can no longer explain, we don't even think we can do it. And that clears the deck. So you can actually step into that bare reality of consciousness. And this is probably a good idea to do with other people. It's the analogy I use, if I'm going to go to the rim of the Grand Canyon and look over, I really want somebody holding on to me. Because it's too big and it's scary. I want someone holding me, and then I can do it. But just by myself is probably not a good idea. That's why we sit together. Because we're in Arkansas, because we're in the South, a quote from a Christian, which is important. I was raised Southern Baptist, so that's what I come from. And it made a huge, powerful, positive difference in my life, and it brought me many, many pains, but it was crucial and I still value it. There's Thomas Merton, so that's an easy one, you know. True love and prayer are learned in the hour when love becomes impossible and the heart has turned to stone. You know what happened with the Buddha? He did all the practices his teacher, well, Siddhartha Gautama had all teachers. It wasn't the Buddha. And those teachers gave him practices. He apparently was like a spiritual genius. He did all of them. And he did them really great. All of them. And it didn't answer his question about suffering. And so then he said, well, I guess I'll just sit down. Basically, he failed. He did all the practices and he was a failure. So he sat down under a tree and said, I'm going to sit here until I understand this thing. Because I've done all the other practices. So the whole wheel of Dharma started turning. And by the way, it really got its initial turn with Sujata. You know this story? When he was doing the ascetic practices and was almost dead from doing them, because they thought, kill the body and your spirit. Well, no, you don't have to kill the body. Just kill all the ideas that the body holds. But he was almost dead. So this young woman was coming to one of the temples, the Hindu temple. There's no Buddhism. It's all Hinduism. She was bringing some sweet cream and rice and stuff as an offering to put, at the temple. And she sees him by the side of the road. And she's like, dude, you look really bad. Or something like that. And said, you need to eat. And he did accept it because he'd also had that part of the story where he hears in the river next to him music. And the thing about, if the strings are too tight, they break. If they're too loose, there's no music. But the middle way. And so that's when the wheel of the Dharma started to turn. Not from some esoteric thing that he got from the heavens. The gods didn't speak to him. He didn't have some revelation. A young girl was kind. Mindful, diligent care. Appamada. Someone was nice to him. Noticed that he needed something and gave him something. And it turned everything. And it was a woman. One of my friends, who I practiced with quite a bit when I was in San Francisco Zen Center, her last name is Robert. She has a new Dharma name. I can't remember it now. Anyway, she wrote a book on Uji, which is one of Dogen's fascicles on time and being. It's one of the most complicated things. She did a good job. Listen to what she wrote. Experiencing our interconnection and interpenetrating relationship with all beings is the foundation of peace and healing, of real joy, and any moments of happiness. Even the most ordinary, challenging tasks become meaningful and fulfilling when we feel a universal connection with the totality of being. Remember that we're all connected all the time. Then we have shared meaning. We're all in this together. The truth is that the awakening we talk about in spiritual practice is actualizing what is fully presencing in this moment. That's an interesting sentence, isn't it? The truth is that the awakening we talk about in spiritual practice is actualizing what is fully presencing in this moment, including the self. And my last question, how do we continue to work for the benefit of others? Well, it has to do with this connection, but through sustained practice and spiritual friendship. Spiritual friendship is a really important thing. We're going to find ourselves more liberated from the tyranny of our unconscious and our unexamined beliefs and perspectives on life. There's a place in the Pali teachings where the Buddha is talking to his cousin Ananda. And some of you may know Ananda was the one that supposedly remembered everything the Buddha taught and passed it on. And so the Buddha was talking to him about Kalyamita, spiritual friendship. And he wasn't getting it, and the Buddha was nudging him. And finally, Ananda says, oh, okay, I get it. Thank you. Finally, I understand. Like, spiritual friendship is like at least half of the whole spiritual path. Like, it's huge. And the Buddha said, no, it's the whole thing. It's the whole thing. This. That's how we keep going. So one last poem from Hakuin, about 17th century, I think, 18th century. What do? He was the guy that revived koan practice in Japan. He says, make your upper garments into a monk's robe. Make the chair your sitting cushion. Make the mountains, rivers, and the great earth your sitting platform. Make the whole universe your own personal meditation cave. This is the true practice of the sages of the past and of today. In other words, where's your practice? Here, everywhere. This is it, folks. You don't need to go anywhere else. I just mean EBS. I mean, you know. And so we're going to talk in the retreat about the forms these take. And in Zen, we talk about practice, path, and vow. What's the practice? What's the path? And what's the vow? Zazen is the fundamental, non-negotiable sitting practice. The path is, the Eightfold Path. And the vow is the Bodhisattva vow. I'm not sure about, it's different translations. The translation that we often use is beings are numberless, I vow to free them all. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassable, I vow to embody it. And by the way, we changed, you do things in Buddhism 3 times, right? And we changed it in our center. We did that recitation, I vow, and then the second one we do is beings are numberless, we vow. Dharma gates are endless, we vow. Third recitation, beings are numberless, this vow frees them all. Delusions are inexhaustible, this vow ends them all. Dharma gates are boundless, this vow enters them all. On TikTok they say, wait for it. Okay, the last line, Buddha's way is unsurpassable. This vow embodies it. Boom. So these are the essential qualities of the unfolding of this path. And one last quotation, and we're done. This is from Joko Beck, a contemporary Dharma teacher who's died, but she was one of Mozumi Roshi's heirs, and she was created the San Diego Zen Center. I got to spend some time with her. She was quite a force. She was asked to come to Naropa at one point, and a lot of the Tibetan teachers wanted to see her because they'd heard that and they came out of the Dokusan room with their hair blown back. They're like, wow, she's like the real thing. But this is how she talks. She says, we have a life that's happening all the time. A wonderful, fluid, amazing life, which we may like or dislike, but there it is, all the time. And we have a very fixed, narrow little set of behaviors with which we try to process this vast experience. The secret of experience, the whole of life, is just to be whatever we're experiencing. Just to be whatever we're experiencing. When we can let go of our thought-based personal desire for things to work out a particular way, for the first time, the pain that we feel begins to open up. And when it opens up, the feeling gets clear and quiet. And at the end, there's silence and wonder. Finally, there's nothing, just wonder. Underneath all our difficulties, there's this well of silence, which is real wisdom. Whatever you want to call it, it's there. And through silence in our practices, this is what we'll enter in retreat. So that was a lot. You're very kind to sit this long listening. But if you have any questions, we do have a little bit of time. It's probably good to engage. But I hope this had some meaning or some relevance to your practice, and might be useful. Anything pop up you want to make a comment on, or a question about, or a complaint? I'll take those.
Excuse me. What about the role of, you said you have to
let go of, letting go of expectations and for things to work out a certain way. But what about, hope and prayer and, like, somebody that's sick and that
Yeah.
kind of thing? I mean, you still hope they get
That's
better.
right. I wrote an article one time for my blog called "Hope is Cruel," and I'll tell you why. Because I'm not negating what you're saying in the least. The way that we tend to use hope is a veiled version of "I want it to turn out like this," instead of the larger view of hope, which is I want the very best outcome for this person that I love, whatever that might be. But because we're going to have to go with what happens. And we don't know what that's going to be. But of course we send our love and our best efforts. That's our whole practice is about mindful, diligent care. So I'm only making a bit of a distinction in this word hope, which can get a little, it can be a spiritualized version of preference. It gets to be problematic. And I'm going to indulge my preferences in a wholesome way as much as I possibly can, because I want good things for people, knowing that I'll be disappointed. And that's okay, because that's the price of love. I'm going to cling to people that I love and attach to them, because that's the price of love. I'm going to have to grieve. On, what's today, Friday? On Monday, I did the eulogy for my mother-in-law, who just died a few weeks ago at 85. And I did it because her 4 children said, you do it. Instead of them speaking. And we talked about the price of love, which is the things that you're talking about. We want to make our best efforts, absolutely, for ourselves and for other people and for the world, and hope they turn out well, knowing that everything will fall apart at some point. This too shall pass. And that's part of the deal. That's not a mistake. That's the way it goes. The mistake is to cling to it and think it should go my way, and it didn't. And when you do feel that, then you let yourself be pissed off. And you feel anger fully, knowing that that's going to go also. And that's the price of caring. So I don't know if I'm responding.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's something else in your question, though, because it sounds like you're like, well, I mean...
No, that makes sense. I mean, when you're raised in the Christian tradition, I was brought up Catholic, and you just have this, you're kind of trained to pray, for things to get better for somebody or
Exactly.
for yourself or whatever.
Exactly.
It's just kind of a cultural custom, or,
Yes.
from your faith. So it's just tricky distinction.
Yeah, and I'm just making a distinction because I don't have a problem with that at all. I'm just making a distinction so that it becomes not a source of contraction and further. See, there's a lot of necessary suffering we have to face. It just goes with the deal. But what Buddhism does is that it gives us practices which helps us reduce the unnecessary suffering. The part we add on, the making it worse part, that's what Buddhist practice does. It doesn't free you from, that would be like transcending being alive. You're going to have suffering if you're alive. Bad stuff's going to happen. We say bad, just means stuff you don't like. Things are going to happen. If you're alive, you got a body, that happened, you got born, and you're probably going to get sick at some point. You're going to have things that are going to be challenging, and eventually you're going to die. And a whole bunch of really fabulous, wonderful, incredible things are going to happen in the meantime too. And if you want to be awake for those, you have to be awake for the first part, because you can't cut off one and not have the other. You can say yes to life. Someone asked me recently, what's the primary turn where you really know that you're practicing deeply and like you're beginning to wake up? I said it goes something like this. Okay, I'll live my life. I give up. I live it. With you. Even though you drive me crazy sometimes. But apparently, you drive me crazy because I care. And it makes a difference. anything else that would be useful? This is like a lemonade stand, you know, like open for business.
So, I'm not particularly well versed in all of the readings and all of that, but, so there's this sense of selflessness, right? Like, but how does that go along with, okay, you're going to care about certain things? To me, it's like, I've always been, the past couple of years, I've been thinking, stop clinging to all this stuff. And you're saying, okay, you're gonna cling no matter what.
Yep.
And it feels like flies in the face of what you're trying to do with the egolessness.
The poem of the third ancestor that I was just teaching on a couple of weeks ago, called the Shin Shin Ming, is my favorite thing. Somebody said to me, if you had to give up all your books, everything you've ever taught on, you only teach on one thing forever, what would it be? I said, Shin Shin Ming. The first line is, the great way is not difficult for those who are unattached to their preferences. Because they don't have them. Let go of longing and aversion and everything will be perfectly clear. There's a whole bunch of these dualities. At one point it says, don't keep searching for the truth. Just let go of your opinions. So, we are attaching creatures that you're not going to get out of that. But can we not have some new prejudice, which we call our spiritual practice, that says we shouldn't be attached to things? See, this is tricky. When it says, don't keep searching for the truth, just let go of your opinions. Our strongest opinions are about our spiritual practice. It should be this way. It would be great if we could do that. The Dharma isn't about that. It's about letting go of having a new prejudice, basically, and knowing that that's going to keep happening. But the mind of awakening, when you begin to really, through time and effort, we're talking psychologically and a lot right now, but when you step back into a larger space of pure awareness, it doesn't move. It doesn't have an opinion. It's a clear mirror. That dedication I gave, may all awakened beings extend with true compassion, that luminous mirror wisdom, it's like this great mirror that reflects reality back. And from that place, it seems cool, in a way, to see something terrible and not have a reaction to it. Because psychologically, reactivity will happen. But there can also be a place of non-reactivity. One of my students said the other day she had a dream in which she stepped into that place and she felt terror. She called it, in the dream she met me and I responded to something by being neutral. I was warm and all, but neutral. And she said neutral terrified me. But she said, oh, I realize now neutral holds the terror and neutral holds the bliss. Neutral is that large space that can hold the whole thing. And you can become more intimate with and identified with that way of being, even while it all goes on. You're not going to transcend being a human. You're not going to give up all of your attachments, but you can be not so attached to your attachments. You can hold them lightly. One of my teachers used to call it it's not that we lose ourself, we just become a provisional floating center. It's like we got to have somebody here to know how to give the money to the IRS and how to feed ourselves and all that stuff. There is a person here. You don't lose yourself. You just realize that self only exists because of everything else. So the self is empty. What's it empty of? Individuality. What's full of is everything. So we go round and around in circles like this. It gets a little crazy. Suzuki Roshi one time said to one of his students, he said, it's not paradoxical. It's probably not true. He also said we live constantly off balance against a background of perfect balance. And it's that realization that I'm talking about. Once again, you can't step into the perfect balance side and leave the other. Joan Sutherland, one of my favorite teachers that I quoted earlier, she says, enlightenment is not the goal of practice. The goal of practice is awakening. Enlightenment's only one side. and darkenment is the other. Yes, we need to open that eye and that heart and that mind and that body which sheds light on that which has been occluded and opens it up, and we see the vast beauty of the world. And we need to dive deep down into that which we don't understand and don't know and can't make sense of. Not just shadow material, but deep into the night where things are quiet and still and fermenting. And the combination of enlightenment and endarkenment opens us to awakening. That's a much bigger thing. And that's the real spirit of practice. And why I talk like this. If that's okay. If you study with me, that's what you get. So maybe we should stop. It's getting late. We're going to come back tomorrow. Thank you very, very much.
I would like to remind anyone who's coming tomorrow that you need to bring a vegetarian lunch to eat here so that we can maintain our
Usually done in the beginning of a Dharma talk in Zen Center, but it goes like this. An unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect Dharma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. It's this amazing thing, but it's basically, you want to feel in your body, not memorize. Not, how do you taste the truth? So.